Okay, so this week in U.S. history, we are looking at the beginnings of the American Revolution. We're going to look first off at the events that lead us down the road to revolution, and then we're going to be talking about the ideology behind the revolution, those thoughts from guys like John Locke and Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson that help us explain the emotions that we're feeling and also help us explain what's going to happen next, which is namely the war, the Revolutionary War. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the events that are leading us on this pathway. Okay, now we talked about a big event last week, and that was the French and Indian War. And the outcome of the French and Indian War, the British win. France leaves the New World, okay? It gives up Canada and it gives up all the land to the Mississippi River. It's still going to control some land on the other side of the Mississippi River for a while. And then we had that incident with the Native Americans, and the British drew that line through the Appalachian Mountains, saying that the colonists could not cross that line. Of course, we do it anyway because it's an imaginary line, and Britain is mad, we're mad, the Native Americans are mad, and France is mad. Okay? At the end of the war, remember, Britain is heavily in debt. And that's where we're going to pick up the story because everything that happens in today's lesson is in direct relation to that debt, okay, and Britain trying to get that debt paid off. Now, the first thing it does in 1763, the same year the war ended, the same year the proclamation is passed, is Britain passes what is called writs of assistance. Now, a writ of assistance, or in particular this writ of assistance, gave tax collectors from England the right to search anywhere in the colonies without a warrant. Homes, businesses, whatever. And we talked about this last week. This was an effort to stop smuggling. Okay. And I told you last week, smuggling is kind of like stealing. You take goods that aren't yours and you end up selling them and pocketing the profit. Okay, so like these are British goods that were supposed to be sold by British merchants, and then part of the proceeds were supposed to go back to Britain. Well, they were taken by the colonists and sold by the colonists. So the colonists get the money, Britain doesn't. And Britain needs the money because it's in financial crisis, it's in debt. So Britain is very much interested in stopping the smuggling. So they say, look, we're going to give our agents the right to search your homes and businesses without a warrant, and if they find any smuggled goods, you're going to pay. Okay? Now, besides that upsetting us, we also see this as a way of Britain trying to get information from us. Okay? What we begin to say is, you guys are just doing this to check up on us. You're going to come in our homes and our businesses and you're going to spy on us and use that information against us. And we don't like that. Okay, so this anger is continuing to grow. Now, what is the quickest way for a government to raise money from its population? To raise taxes. So after the 1763 writ of assistance law to crack down on smuggling, in 1764 we get our first act. Okay, and this act is another word for tax. Okay, in 1764, Parliament enacts a law known as the Sugar Act. Okay, in reality, it is a tax on sugar and other goods. Okay, now I'll be honest with you, there are a bunch of acts, there are a bunch of taxes. We are just going to focus on a few. Okay. Now, in 1764, what the Sugar Act does, surprise, surprise, is it increases taxes on foreign goods like sugar, wine, cloth, and coffee. Now, one of the products that was being smuggled was molasses. Okay. In fact, colonists like molasses. You cook with it. You add it to drinks like coffee. Okay. It's a sweetener. All right. Of course, molasses is also key in making syrup. All right. So we'd been smuggling a lot of molasses. Well, what the act does, it raises all the prices on these goods, but it actually drops the tax on molasses. Okay, now you still have to pay a molasses tax, but it decreases that molasses tax, hoping that it will stop smuggling. Okay, now at face value, okay, in fact, that's what the British are going to focus on. Hey, look at what we're doing. We're going to decrease your tax on molasses, so don't worry about smuggling it. But in reality, the colonists pick up on it and they're like, look, don't do that to us. We're not stupid, okay? You're dropping the tax on one product and raising the taxes on other things like sugar, wine, cloth, and coffee, okay? So don't pretend that this is something good. Plus, the tax on molasses is still there. You're just decreasing it, okay? So not only are we upset about being taxed, but we're upset that Britain is trying to pull something over on us, okay, by focusing on the fact, oh, look, we're dropping the tax on molasses. No, you're not. You're raising the tax on everything else. So by the end of 1764, relationships between the colonies and Great Britain are getting worse, okay? We are beginning to disagree more and more about how the colonies should be taxed and how they should be governed, okay? Because with the ability to search our properties without warrants, this is a serious infringement on our self-government, okay, and a serious infringement on the rights that we would expect as Englishmen and Englishwomen back in the mother country. So things are getting worse between Britain and us. Now you would think that Britain might take a step back and like, look, okay, we actually like the colonies. We don't want anything to happen to the colonies. We certainly don't want to fight a war. So maybe we need to take a step back and discuss some things with them. Okay? But instead, in 1765, the British Parliament passes another tax. This time, it is the Stamp Act or the stamp tax. Okay? Now, what the Stamp Act does is it is a piece of paper, it is a stamp. The stamp itself is the tax, and the stamp itself is put on any papered goods. Okay, so 1765, we get the Stamp Act. It required colonists to buy and place these stamps on 54 kinds of articles: wills, documents, cards, papers, and deeds. Basically, anything that was made out of paper had this stamp on it. In fact, some colonists remarked, Britain is trying to tax us from the cradle to the grave, because what is your birth certificate printed on? Paper. What is your will printed on? What is your death certificate printed on? Paper. So you got to pay a tax from the time you're born to the time you die. Now, this is a big deal. This is the first tax that affects the colonists directly, okay, because it places it on everyday goods that they buy. Now, here's the thing, okay, if you didn't want to buy sugar or wine or cloth or coffee, if you didn't want to pay that sugar act, that sugar tax, you could just avoid those goods, okay? It's going to be hard to not purchase paper. Right? Everything is on paper. I mean, newspapers, anything is going to be on paper. You can't escape this tax. Now, if you look up there in the cartoon, the last guy there says, it even taxes my playing cards and dice. Now, why would Britain be taxing your playing cards and your dice? What do you use playing cards and dice for? Gambling. What does Britain not want you to do? Gamble. Why? Because you're going to be losing money that needs to go where? To Great Britain. Okay? So Great Britain is going to tax your means of gaming, your means of gambling, because they're like, look, we don't want you guys gambling and losing money that needs to be coming back to us to pay off the war debt from the French and Indian War. Okay? So once again, the colonists are getting angrier and angrier. This new tax is impacting them directly. There's no way they're going to be able to avoid it. Okay? So once again, the division between the colonists is getting worse. Okay? The division between the colonists and the mother country, Britain, is getting worse. This new tax is angering the colonists. Now, one of the things they decide to do is boycott British goods, okay? If you guys are going to be this way, we will simply stop buying your stuff, okay? Now, that is somewhat effective, but it's going to be harder to do than to say, okay? Because one of the things Britain's also going to do is try to clamp down on trade with other countries. It is going to be difficult for us to boycott British goods because we're almost dependent on Britain for things that we can't produce ourselves. To organize these boycotts, okay, however effective they are, we see the emergence of a new group called the Sons of Liberty. Okay, now the Sons of Liberty were a secret group formed by patriots, formed by colonists, to help begin to play a more active role in our opposition to Britain. And the group was founded by this gentleman right here. Okay, he's from Massachusetts. Sadly, he is associated more with an adult beverage today than his activity with the Sons of Liberty and his activity during the American Revolution. This gentleman is Sam Adams. Okay, Samuel Adams founded the Sons of Liberty. He's a political activist, and he's going to begin to call for our active participation in showing Britain how much we do not like what they are doing. Okay? Now, the big issue is representation. The colonists believe Parliament could not tax them because we are not represented in Parliament. Okay? They argue that only colonial lawmaking bodies have the right to tax them. So it's not that we're opposed to taxes per se. We're just saying, look, Parliament, you don't represent us. You won't let us have representation in Parliament, so you shouldn't be the one taxing us. We will pay taxes, but we will pay taxes to our colonial lawmaking bodies, not to you. And the rallying cry becomes no taxation without representation. Now, this is always one of those weird what ifs of history, okay? What if Britain had started listening to us and say, okay, we will grant you guys 2 members of parliament, okay? We will give you representation. What would have happened then? Don't know, okay? We don't know. The cry is no taxation without representation. So, had we had representation, we might have been willing to pay the taxes, okay? We don't know. But, all right, Parliament never gives us that choice. All right, now in 1766, Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act. Okay, and we have a minor victory. All right, so that tax on every paper good and stuff like that gets repealed, and we think, okay, things are going to improve here. But the following year, Parliament comes right back with a new tax, the Townshend Act. Okay, or the Townshend Acts. All right, plural. Now, this was passed in 1767, all right? And it taxed a bunch of different imports. It taxed more imports. It taxed glass, lead, paint. Paper comes back into the mix. So even though they get rid of the Stamp Act, they replace it with the Townshend Act, which taxes paper to begin with. And then it puts the tax on tea, okay? And this is going to be a big one because tea is very, very popular in the colonies. All right. Once again, we protest these new taxes. Boston is going to become kind of the center of the opposition here. Okay. This is where the colonists are really going to oppose Britain's acts against us. Okay. And the people protest. They lead boycotts. They lead riots. Effigies of the British tax merchants are burned. British tax merchants are kidnapped and tarred and feathered. That's where they pour boiling hot oil all over you or boiling hot tar over you and then dump a bunch of chicken feathers, and the tar solidifies with the feathers in there and it hurts. Okay, not only does it hurt because it's boiling, but then it dries and you got all these feathers in you, and you have to pull it off your skin. It's basically going to rip your skin off. Okay, it is very, very painful. Now, in response to all this, the British send troops in America because they think there's going to be a riot. Okay, and we've already talked about this because Britain had sent troops after the French and Indian War. We don't appreciate the British troops here to begin with. Now Britain is sending even more troops, which is going to make us even angrier. And by the way, what does Britain have to pay to send these troops here? More money. And what is Britain dealing with? A financial crisis. So they're just adding fuel to the fire, so to say, on both fronts. They're making us angrier, and they're spending more of their money and getting more in debt because they're sending more troops over. All right. Now, once again, we start to boycott British goods. Okay. We refuse to import British goods. We begin to boycott. We say we're not going to buy this stuff. We do things like we have spinning bees to make cloth. Okay. Basically, everybody gets together in their homes, or maybe you gather together at the meeting house in your town or whatever, and everybody makes cloth. And the person that makes the most wins a prize. Okay. It's a spinning bee. We also begin to do things like tea. Tea is a popular drink. We don't want to pay the tea tax, so we have it smuggled in, or we make our own from like raspberry leaves or other types of leaves that we find here. Okay, there are various reports about how good that tea is. It definitely doesn't taste as good as British tea, but it makes us feel good because we are doing our own thing so we can avoid buying the British tea. Okay. Now, once again, you would think, okay, Britain, maybe you ought to take a step back. Things are getting worse between you and the American colonies. You just continually do stuff to make them mad. Maybe we should both step aside, catch our breath, talk things out, and prevent it from getting worse. But that's not what happens. Okay? In the winter, 1770, a group of Boston protesters gathered to harass some British soldiers. It's actually March of 1770, but it's up in Massachusetts. Boston's in Massachusetts, and it's still wintertime up there. Okay? And this group of protesters gathered together, and what they do is there's snow on the ground, so they gather some snow and they start throwing snowballs at the British troops. Okay? And then they decide, hey, you know what? We can put stuff in the snowballs. So they start picking up rocks. They start putting like rotten food in the snowballs and stuff like that. And they start throwing those at the British officers. Now, keep in mind, some of these British officers are brand new to the colonies. And they don't quite understand why people don't like them and why people are so hostile. And here you have this huge group of people coming. They're yelling at you. They're angry at you. This is your first time in the new world. You're very nervous. They're throwing snowballs at you. And then all of a sudden, the snowballs start to hurt because there's junk inside of them. Well, the British soldiers panic and they fire into the crowd. And when the smoke clears, 5 Bostonians have been killed. Okay, including one of them, Crispus Attucks, who was an African American. Okay. Now, colonial leaders are going to call this the Boston Massacre. Now, I am not trying to belittle the fact that 5 people died, because 5 people died. I'm not trying to belittle that. But when you think of massacre, you think many, many more people, okay, than just 5. But this is the spin that colonial leaders put on it. And their take on it is fueled by this illustration. Now, if we were in class, we could talk about it a little bit. I want to show you down here. I know it's difficult for you to see, but right here is the name of the engraver. It's Paul Revere. Okay. Now, I actually heard a story from a silversmith in Williamsburg about this illustration. Everybody gives Paul Revere credit for it, but actually, supposedly, somebody else turned in the illustration. Revere was going to engrave it and put the gentleman's name on it, but then Revere took the illustration himself and put his name on it. So this isn't really, according to this guy, this isn't really Paul Revere's work, even though Paul Revere gets the credit for it. Okay. And I can't substantiate that with any, I don't know where he got his information from, but this might not be Paul Revere's work, even though he takes the credit for it. Okay. Now let's look at this picture. Okay. Clearly, who are the bad guys here? It's the British. Okay, notice no snow on the ground, no snowballs or anything like that. Clearly, it looks like the British marched out and they just opened fire on this group of people right here. And you've got all this blood. You've got this guy laying here. He's got shot in the head. This guy has blood coming out of his stomach, out of his side. There's blood here. There's blood there. this, and then there's this guy back here that's getting carried away. Clearly, this is a massacre. And to top it all off, you got a little dog down there in the foreground right here, and the British are firing at the dog. Okay, the bastards. Can't believe they did that. All right. So when this appears in newspapers, this makes people believe, oh my gosh, this has been a massacre. Okay, so in 1770, we get the Boston Massacre. It is the first clash between colonists and the British. Okay, the British troops fire on these anti British demonstrators. 5 people are killed. And since blood has been spilled and people have died, we're going to start talking more and more about revolution. Okay, now what's interesting is the British soldiers that open fire, okay, are put on trial. All right, they're put on trial here in the colonies. All right, and eventually they are acquitted. All right, because it was determined that the crowd provoked them, and they were firing in self-defense. Okay, and the gentleman that helps defend the British officers is John Adams. John Adams is cousin to Sam Adams, who's the founder of the Sons of Liberty. John Adams will go on to become our first vice president and our second president, okay, and is known as a leader in the revolution, but he defends these British troops because he wants to see justice served, okay? Now, after this event, as horrific as it is, things calm down. From 1770 to 1773, both sides kind of take a step back and they say, whoa, it's gotten real. Okay, it's gotten serious. We need to stop down. We need to take a step back. We need to slow down, or we're going to be on the road to war. Okay, now that doesn't mean everything's all peaceful and everybody's getting along, because the boycotts and the protests are going to continue. Okay, and Britain is still going to be in financial crisis. So while there isn't any more bloodshed between 1770 and 1773, the tensions are going to be there, and the tensions will eventually increase again. It is also during this time that the colonial assemblies, remember, the colonies are still not used to working together as one. The colonial assemblies decide we need to be able to communicate with each other and figure out what's going on. We need to be able to stand together. So they form what are called committees of correspondence. Okay. And the job of the committee of correspondence is to communicate with committees of correspondence in other colonies. So your colony has a committee of correspondence, Pennsylvania has a committee of correspondence, and their job is to communicate back and forth and to communicate with the people within the colony about various threats to American liberty. Okay, so in case we need to start acting together and doing something to stop this, we will. Okay, now 1773, something significant is going to happen. British tea is very, very expensive. So colonists have been smuggling tea in from Holland. Okay. Now, the British know this, and of course, again, smuggling takes money away from them, money they need because they're in a financial crisis. So in 1773, the British passed the Tea Act. Okay. Now, what that does is it allows the British East India Company, which is a big trading company. If you're familiar with Pirates of the Caribbean, these are some of the bad guys in Pirates of the Caribbean. It allows them to sell tea directly to colonial retailers without going to colonial wholesalers. Okay, so your retailers are your shop owners. And what the shop owners used to have to do is to go to a wholesaler, and the wholesaler brokers the deal between the retailer and the British East India Company. Okay. Now, what that means is your goods are going to be more expensive because everybody wants their cut. Okay. The British East India Company wants money, the colonial wholesalers want money, and the colonial retailers want money. So, what this does is it takes out that middleman. And what they're trying to do, what the British are trying to do is, hey, you colonists, look, you can buy directly from us and your tea will be cheaper. Okay. And to top it all off, we're going to take all the taxes on tea away, except for the Townshend duty, okay? Except for that Townshend tax. All the other taxes are going to be removed. So now the British tea is cheaper than that smuggled tea, okay? Look at how nice we are, okay? We're taking away these tea taxes except for the Townshend tax, and we're going to cut out the middleman, and now your tea is going to be cheaper. So don't you worry about smuggling tea in from Holland. Come do business with us, okay? Now, it looks good on the surface, and you would think the colonists would be ready for something like this. But those wholesalers are now out of work. And those wholesalers are going around to their communities and saying, look at what Britain is doing. They are putting us out of a job. Your friends, your neighbors who work as colonial wholesalers, Britain is taking away our right to live, our means of making money. Okay? So the wholesalers start complaining that Britain is trying to control colonial business. And they say, once again, don't you be fooled by what Britain is doing. It looks like they're being all nice and they're making the tea cheaper and they're cutting out the taxes and stuff like that, but they're taking away our jobs. And this is one more example of them trying to control us. Okay? They've tried to tell us we can't move west. They've tried to tax us. They're searching for smuggled goods in our homes and our businesses without warrants. They opened fire on us at the Boston Massacre. This is one more example of Britain trying to control us. So don't you fall for it. Now, this is going on while a bunch of tea is coming over to the colonies. The first shiploads of British East India Company tea arrived late in 1773, and the Sons of Liberty are ready. In Charleston, which is in South Carolina, they take the tea off the boats in Charleston, but they lock it in a warehouse, okay? And they say, look, it's just going to sit there and it's going to rot, all right, because we're not going to sell it and we're not going to buy it, okay? So they take it off the boats and they lock it in a warehouse in Charleston. In New York and Philadelphia, the tea doesn't even get off the boats. The captains of the ships, seeing the Sons of Liberty on the docks and stuff like that, they say, look, we're not paid enough to deal with this, and they turn around and go back, okay, without even unloading the tea. Annapolis, which is in Maryland. Now, Annapolis is kind of interesting to me. In Annapolis, they actually burn ships carrying the tea. Okay, they actually the Sons of Liberty set fire to the ships and burn them up as they carry tea. Okay. Now, all these are significant, and what you're going to notice that the activity is getting more intense. Okay, we're locking the tea in a warehouse, then we're turning the ships around, and now we're actually physically destroying property because we're burning the ships. But the incident that gains the most attention is the one in Boston. Okay, the captains tried to turn back. The captains of the tea ships tried to turn back. They're like, look, we've heard stories. Annapolis, they're burning ships and stuff like that. You know what? It's not worth it. We're going to turn around. We're going to leave. Okay? But the governor of Massachusetts, who's a royal governor and wants to look good for the king, says, no, you guys are going to land this tea. I will protect you. Okay? So you're going to come into the harbor and we're going to get the tea off the boats and we're going to sell the tea. Okay? Now, the Sons of Liberty hear about this. So the boats come into Boston Harbor. They're anchored there at night, and the Sons of Liberty appear disguised as Indians. And they board the ships at night, and they dump the tea into the harbor. Now, nobody is hurt, okay? In some cases, they actually leave the ships in better shape than they were when they got there to begin with, okay? They actually clean stuff up and make sure nobody on the ship is hurt. The captains aren't hurt. The crew's not hurt. We just want the tea. They dump the tea in the harbor. They clean up, and then they go. $75,000 worth of tea is destroyed, and I believe that is $75,000 worth of tea in that year's currency, okay? It would be much, much more expensive now. I think it's actually in the millions, okay, in terms of how much tea is destroyed. But $75,000 worth of tea is destroyed. And history will remember this event as the Boston Tea Party. In fact, I think that's probably why we remember Boston and not like Annapolis, because number one, $75,000 worth of tea is destroyed. And number two, you have this pageantry of the Sons of Liberty showing up dressed as Indians. Okay. Now, here's a picture of the supposed Boston Tea Party. I'll be honest with you, I don't think this is quite how it was. Okay. People knew that it was the Sons of Liberty. In fact, they probably knew, even though it's a secret organization, you probably had a good idea of who was in the Sons of Liberty. I don't think they followed them down to the wharf and cheered them on like you see in this picture, okay? Because you want to do it in secret, you want to do it at night, and then you want to leave. Because remember, Boston is full of British soldiers, okay? And you don't want to draw attention to this and have the soldiers turn out and somebody get hurt or somebody get arrested. So I'm not sure the crowds are there like you see in this picture. All right. But definitely the Sons of Liberty dressed up, and they definitely dumped $75,000 worth of tea into the harbor. Now you can imagine Britain is not happy. King George III is furious. Okay. And to punish Massachusetts, George III and Parliament punish a set of laws known as the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. When you coerce somebody, you kind of force them to do something. You might even say you kind of trick them into doing something. Okay? Now we're going to talk about the Intolerable Acts in just a second, but notice what illustration makes a return. Good old Ben Franklin's cartoon with the snake that's cut up into parts saying join or die. Because when Britain passes the Intolerable Acts, this is going to be the message that the colonists get. We need to join together and fight against Great Britain, or Britain will kill us. We will die. Okay. Now, what are these intolerable acts that lead to this statement becoming popular again? Well, number one, and by the way, this is in 1774. This is a year after the Boston Tea Party. Number one, the British closed the port of Boston. Okay, until all the tea is paid for. You got to pay the $75,000, or we're not opening the port back up. Okay, which essentially means the city is in trouble, okay? Because you depend on the goods coming into the port to survive. I mean, food is coming in, other necessities to keep you alive are coming in. So this is going to be a serious blow when you close the port, all right? Number two, British officers are not going to be tried in America. Remember those officers involved in the Boston Massacre? They get tried here, okay? Not anymore. They would be sent back to England. And chances are, when they get sent back to England, they're going to be found not guilty, if they're even put on trial to begin with. Okay? Because stuff gets lost. It's going to take a while to get back across the Atlantic to England. Okay? Papers get lost. Plus, you, America, would have to send representation over to represent your side, which is not always going to be possible. All right? So, British officers are going to be tried in England, not America. Chances are, if they go to trial, they're going to be found not guilty. Boston is placed under martial law or rule by the military. Okay, Britain has plenty of troops over here, so Britain puts those troops to good use, and Boston is put under martial law. Now, speaking of those troops, okay, guess who now has to take care of those troops? We do. Okay, we are forced to house the British troops in our homes and feed them and give them shelter and give them blankets and take care of them. We are going to be forced to keep them in our homes. And once again, our self-government, especially the self-government in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is getting blamed for the Boston Tea Party, because Boston is in Massachusetts, our self-government is going to be severely limited. Now, the reason these are called the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts is Britain would call them the Coercive Acts, all right? They are trying to get the colonies to get back in line. We are going to call them the Intolerable Acts because we are shocked. We have never seen Britain do this before, okay? They've been doing some things like cracking down on smuggling and raising taxes and stuff like that, but this is really too much, Okay. Now, those committees of correspondence that have been founded, they're going to start spreading the news. Okay. They're the ones that call these acts oppressive and tyrannous. Okay. The British government is acting like a tyrant. And they urge colonies to meet together at a continental congress and decide what to do. Okay. The committees of correspondence are good about spreading news, but they are not working together. Okay. And they urge the colonies, hey, you need to send representatives to some meeting, and that meeting needs to decide what we're going to do next and where we're going to go from here. All right. And then just about every colony sends stuff to Boston to try to help Boston out. And the rationale behind this is if it can happen to Boston, it could happen to any of us. Okay. So we need to help Boston out because goodness knows if it was happening here, we would need help too. Okay. So we're going to help Boston because it could be us next. Now, like I said, Britain caused these coercive acts. They think this is going to get the colonists to get back in line and calm things down, and we will avoid any future conflict. But they have made a big mistake. Parliament has blundered. Instead of crushing the defiance in Massachusetts, it makes things worse. Okay. Massachusetts is seen, specifically Boston, they are seen as martyrs. So instead of scaring the people back into line, now the colonies are even more united. We need to do something about Britain. Okay. So instead of crushing the defiance, Boston and Massachusetts now become martyrs. And the people in the colonies are now even more concerned about what Britain is doing, and they want to see Britain stop what they are doing. The spirit of the Boston Tea Party is going to spread. Okay, the spirit of the Boston Tea Party is going to spread to the other colonies. All right. Now, in response to that, okay, so it's 1774. These coercive acts have been passed. These intolerable acts have been passed. The committees of correspondence have asked the colonies to send delegates to a continental congress. And the spirit of the Boston Tea Party is spreading, and that is exactly what the colonies are going to do. They agree we need to meet together and decide what to do next. Okay, so in 1774, we're going to have the first Continental Congress. Britain's actions prompt the colonial leaders to form the first Continental Congress. Now, at that Continental Congress, they draw up a Declaration of Colonial Rights. And they ask that the colonies be allowed to run their own affairs, okay? Unless Britain is willing to give us representation, okay? And we admit, all right, we want to be able to control some areas. We're not looking to split off yet, okay? We make this very clear to Britain. We're not looking for independence yet. We do want to be able to control our own issues. But if you give us more of a say in a government, and if you give us more rights, and you quit taxing us without representation, you leave your troops at home, you quit the intolerable acts against Boston. If you do these things and protect our rights, then everything's going to be cool, okay? We still want to be part of your empire. We're not asking for independence yet. But if you ignore us and you ignore this petition and you keep doing the things that you're doing that are making us mad, we're going to meet again in 1775. And if we meet again in 1775 and you haven't addressed any of these problems and you've ignored us and things have gotten worse, when we meet again in 1775, we're going to be talking about something different, okay? We're not going to be so peaceful in 1775. If we meet again, we will be talking about war, okay? So be prepared. All right. So that's what the First Continental Congress does. It actually sends a petition. They're going to try one more time to reach out to Britain and work out a deal. Okay. Now, at this Continental Congress, as within any government body, okay, there are going to be different groups, different parties. You have the radicals who are on the extreme side, okay, and they're like, look, forget these petition and forget trying to reach out one more time. Let's just make a break with Britain. Okay. Number one, let's stop all trade with Britain. Forget this protest and stuff like that. Right now, it's just impacting Boston, but let's let every colony stop trading with Britain until the Intolerable Acts are repealed. Now, did the radicals think that was going to happen? Probably not, which leads them to take the next step. Let's go to war, okay? I mean, let's be honest. Let's just make a clean break. They're not going to listen to us anyway. Let's start fighting, okay? And the guys in this group include men like John and Sam Adams. Believe not, John Adams is a radical. You got Patrick Henry from Virginia there. You've got Richard Henry Lee from Virginia there, and Christopher Gadsden. Okay, so these are some of the more radicals. They're going to take an extreme position. Let's go on and break from Britain. Okay, we'll stop all trade, and if need be, we'll go to war. On the other side, you've got the more moderates. Okay, and the moderates are hoping to achieve gradual change through compromise. Okay, and they're the ones that are going to win out. Okay, that's why we're going to send Britain one more letter. Okay, one more chance. Look, repeal the taxes, stop the intolerable acts. We're not looking to be free or independent from you guys. We want to stay part of the empire, but you got to do something for us. Okay, so the moderates are all about compromise and gradual change, and they're going to include guys like George Washington. George Washington is a moderate, and then John Dickinson. Okay, those are two moderates. All right, now do not think of the moderates as weak. Okay, they are trying to achieve the same results, but peacefully. And once war is declared, a bunch of the moderates are going to become radicals and are going to devote themselves wholeheartedly to the quest for independence. Okay, so do not assume that the moderates are weak or bad or anything like that. They are trying one more time to work things out peacefully. When it fails, they will become dedicated. Some of them will become dedicated to this revolution. Some of them are going to go back to Britain, okay, because they don't want war at all. But some of them are going to become, like Washington, is going to become very much dedicated to this quest for independence. Now, while all this is going on, thanks to the radicals, some New England towns. Okay, I'm sorry, before we get there. So here are the actions of the First Continental Congress. All right, they passed these resolves. Okay, they demand an end to the intolerable acts. They denounce Britain's attempts to raise money by taxing colonists. They say, look, we will pay your taxes, but you give us representation. Okay, so this is what they say they want: an end to the intolerable acts, an end to taxation without representation. They also pass a Declaration of Rights. Now, this is not the Declaration of Independence. This is not the Bill of Rights. It is a Declaration of Rights written by Thomas Jefferson and a Pennsylvania lawyer by the name of James Wilson. Okay. They claim that Parliament has no right to tax or make laws for the colonies. Okay. Once again, this cry of no taxation without representation. Okay. They also state that they owe allegiance to the crown, but they're not going to accept the acts of Parliament that violate their rights. So once again, they're saying, look, we're not looking to be independent. We are willing to stay here with you guys, but you got to start treating us right. And if you don't, then we're going to have another conversation. It's going to be a different conversation. We're going to be talking about war this time. Okay? But we still are preaching allegiance to the crown, but you got to treat us right. All right? And in the meantime, between this first meeting of the Continental Congress and the second meeting of the Continental Congress, we are going to have a Continental Association. Okay? We are going to have some sort of meeting of all the colonies. We're going to refuse to import goods from Britain. Okay? All the colonies are going to refuse to import goods from Britain. And if you violate that, okay, if you're one of these colonial merchants and you violate that, or you're one of these colonies and you don't work with the rest of the group, we're going to boycott you, okay? We're going to seize any of the imported goods from Britain, all right, so that you can't sell them. And we're going to put your name in the papers, all right? Now, we're not saying we're going to do anything to you physically. Like, we're not going to kill you or beat you up or anything like that. But we are going to put your names in the papers. And what your neighbors decide to do to you, that's up to them, okay? So we're not saying we're going to be violent, but we are going to put your name in the paper, and who knows what people will do once they start seeing your name there, okay? So this is what we pledge to do in the meantime between the meeting of the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, all right? Now, as I was saying just a second ago, thanks to the radicals, Some people realize this isn't going to work. Okay, Britain has not listened to us before. They're not going to start listening to us now. So we need to start preparing ourselves for war. Okay, so some towns, especially New England, begin to prepare for war. That's when we get these Minutemen, these citizen soldiers. They are called Minutemen because they are ready to fight at a moment's notice. They start drilling, okay, marching, learning how to fire weapons and fight with swords and things like that. And they begin storing guns and ammunition in secret places, just in case they need them, in case war erupts. Okay, so these Minutemen begin to prepare for battle, even though we're not there yet. Okay, now we got a couple more slides to do, and I'll explain what they are here in just a second. But one of the things that's kind of sad about all this, and I heard this last year at the Social Studies Convention in Williamsburg, there was a guy there from the Yorktown Foundation that was talking about everything that was going on with the American Revolution and the causes of the American Revolution. And he was talking about this cry of no taxation without representation. And again, I haven't read this specifically. The book he mentioned was called Founding Myths. And this whole notion of no taxation without representation is kind of a myth, because all of Britain's colonies were going to have to pay taxes, not just us, but her colonies in Africa, her other colonies in Europe, okay, her colonies in the Caribbean. Everybody was going to have to pay taxes. And if you look on paper, what the 13 colonies in North America were going to have to pay compared to everybody else, we weren't paying that much. Okay? So one of the ironies, one of the myths in all this is we think, oh man, they're being so oppressive and these taxes are unbearable and stuff like that. If you look on paper, we actually got off pretty easy. But we're still upset because we're getting taxed and we don't have representation. Okay? So it's not the amount, it's the fact that we're still getting taxed, and then that's going to lead Britain to do all this other stuff, which is only going to make us angrier. All right? So if we had calmed down, if Britain had maybe listened to us and given us representatives, who knows what would have happened? Okay? But it's the principle of the thing, and now we've gotten to a part in the history of this country, in the history of the story of our nation and the story of the revolution, where there's not going to be any turning back. Okay? Now, I've covered a lot of material here with this lesson. You're going to have a little quiz, and I'll be honest with you, the quiz is going to be matching, and it's going to be based on terms, okay? So you need to be sure that you got these terms down, okay? By the way, there's some pictures of the Minutemen, including the Minuteman Monument or the Minutemen Monument at Lexington and Concord, and we'll talk more about Lexington and Concord in the next lesson, okay? So we're going to have a quiz on these notes. It's going to be a matching quiz. Be sure you know these terms, okay? Number one is a boycott. A boycott is when you refuse to purchase goods. We refuse to purchase goods from Britain, okay? That is our boycott. Number two, a patriot. Okay. A patriot is someone who is pro-colonist and anti-British. We are going to talk more about patriots as we get into the fight. Okay. But the patriots are pro-colonist, anti-British. Okay. In fact, you might even say there are some patriots over in England because they are pro-colonist and they're anti-British. Okay. There are some members of parliament that even now are beginning to tell the king, just let him go. Okay. Let him go. It's not worth it. Let him go. Okay, so we might even refer to them as patriots because they are pro-colonist and they are anti-British. Don't forget, an import is a good brought into our country. A tariff is a tax on those imported goods. Okay, a tariff in general is just a tax. All right, we're going to specify it's a tax on imported goods, but a tariff itself is just a tax. Then you have exports. Exports are goods that are brought out of our country to another country. So imports are brought in, exports are sent out from our country to another country. The Sugar Act, remember the Sugar Act was that tax on molasses and sugar. It actually decreased the tax on molasses. The tax on molasses is still there. It just decreases that tax, but it does increase the tax on sugar and other foreign imports like wine. The Quartering Act, okay? Now, we didn't talk about this one. We talked about the principle behind it, but we didn't actually mention the Quartering Act. Your quarters are your shelter, okay? It's where you stay. And we talked about the British government forced the colonists to take care of British soldiers. That's the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act required colonists to provide shelter and supplies for the British. Okay, so one of those early on acts, the Townshend Acts, that was in response to colonial boycotts and stuff like that. And Britain says, you guys will take care of the soldiers now. This is the act that does it. Okay, the Quartering Act forces the colonists to provide shelter and supplies for the British. Then don't forget about the Boston Tea Party. That's the action to protest the taxes where tea is dumped into Boston Harbor. You've got the First Continental Congress, which is our first attempt at a united colonial government. It met in Philadelphia in 1774 in response to the Intolerable Acts in 1773, and they said they would meet again in 1775 if Britain does not meet our demands and does not listen to us. And then, of course, you've got the Proclamation of 1763, which was Britain's attempt to prevent us from settling west in the Appalachian Mountains, and was one of the first events to get us on this road to revolution. Okay. Now, like I said, we've gone over a lot of material. I'm going to summarize that material in the next lesson with the notes on mutiny. Be sure you know the terms that we've gone over, okay? We are well on our way to fighting a revolution. We are on the path. There is no turning back. We're going to investigate the ideas behind this, the ideology of Locke and Paine and Jefferson, and how we're making sense of all this and how we're going to justify what's going to occur next. All that is coming as we move through the beginning of the revolution the rest of this week.